going to look at how molecules or particles can move in and out of cells. And there's three mechanisms that we need to understand for GCSE. There's diffusion, active transport, and osmosis. Diffusion can be defined as how particles or molecules move from one place to another, and we tend to talk about net movement. That means that where they move them in the most quantity from and to. So we might get greater net movement from one area to another. So we're talking about how molecules are able to diffuse from one place to another in terms of net movement. Let's put that into an example, considering a cell. So this dotted line down here is representing what we call a partially permeable membrane. The cell membrane is partially permeable because there's bits or holes in there where things can pass through. That's what permeable means. Now, as you can see, we've got some molecules here spread throughout on both sides. We've got some blue molecules, and on one side we've got some red molecules. Let's talk about those for a minute. So on the left hand side, we would say that these molecules are in high concentration. On the other side of the partially permeable membrane, they're in low concentration. There aren't any either there. So these molecules, these red molecules, are going to move around. The blue ones will as well, but for our simplicity, we're going to keep those still. So the red ones are going to move around. Now, because they're going to move around, some of them are going to end up on the other side. So we've got greater net movement in this direction. And they've moved from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that's how we're describing it. Molecules or particles move by diffusion from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until they're roughly in equal concentration. Now, they won't stop moving now. For example, this molecule could move this way and that molecule could be moving that way. But generally, from now on, they'll stay in balance. And that's diffusion in cross cells. Now, diffusion can be applied to many things in life, and there's going to be loads of examples that you might be familiar with, perhaps something you've smelt. So let's take, for example, somebody releases some noxious chemicals from their anus. They're molecules, they're particles, and they will start to diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. You get greater net movement away from the anus. Eventually, some of these particles will arrive in high enough concentration to your nasal cavity. Once there, they'll trigger the smell receptors, and you'll be able to detect. You'll be able to say to the person who dealt it, "Oh, you've released some molecules in high concentration around your anus, and they have diffused from an area of high concentration to low concentration to my nose." And at the same time, you'll be revising. Coming back to inside the body now, diffusion is really important to explain how we get gas exchange across the alveoli. The alveoli are the air sacs of the lungs, and the air, the oxygen in the air, has to get into the blood. Now, it's able to do that because in the air sacs, the oxygen is in high concentration, so the oxygen will diffuse into the blood. Likewise, in turn, carbon dioxide has come into the lungs in high concentration in the blood, so it diffuses from a high concentration to a low concentration into the air sacs, and that's how we're able to exchange our gases. Sometimes molecules have to move against the concentration gradient, this time from a low to a high. Now, this is going to take energy. Whereas before, diffusion was free of energy. This is going to take energy. Think of it like you're trying to travel up a hill. That takes energy to go up a hill. So here our concentration is going upwards from a low to a high. So because it uses energy, it uses the word active. Active, whenever you see that in biology, implies that energy is involved. So this is a kind of transport of molecules that requires energy. So let's take, for example, a root hair cell. Root hair cells tend to have a large surface area, and quite often these root hair cells have to take more mineral ions out of the soil into the cell. Now, as you can see in this diagram, the concentration of the mineral ions is low outside of the cell, but inside the cell is already high. So the cell needs to take more in, but it can't do it by diffusion alone because the concentration gradient is the wrong way round. Fortunately, there are in the cell membrane some proteins, and these proteins are able to pick up these molecules and take them into the cell. But to do so, it uses energy. The energy will change the shape of the proteins and allow them to take these molecules against the concentration gradient, in other words, from a low concentration to a high concentration into the cell. Hence, active transport. So it's diffusion in reverse, and it requires energy. Other examples, other than plant root hair cells, are, for example, the digestive system in animals. The digestive system is responsible for taking molecules that you have digested in the food into the blood supply. So the cells that do that, that line this, are the intestinal villi cells. And they will take up some molecules, mostly by diffusion. So for example, these yellow dots represent glucose. Some of that could have occurred by diffusion because of the high concentration in intestines. But that means that the concentration of glucose molecules in the intestinal villi cells is now high as well, and there may well be some more glucose in the intestines that you need to absorb. You don't want to poo them out because you spent a lot of time digesting the food to get them. So here the glucose molecules will be taken up by active transport into the intestinal villi so that you don't. So that's an example of active transport in animals. Our final mechanism of transport comes back to diffusion again, but this time we call this type of diffusion osmosis. What osmosis is that it's diffusion entirely of water. Now, an example you might have come across is if you've ever put salt onto a slug, something that I used to do avidly when I was a younger self. I didn't realise at the time, but I was actually performing a science experiment. As I put salt in the slug, I'd see them slowly wither away and they would die. I didn't really understand why at the time, but it turns out that I was actually observing osmosis in action. Another example of osmosis in action is if you put your fingers into the bath for so long, they seem to get swollen bits and wrinkled up. Again, this is entirely due to water and osmosis, so water molecules cause diffusion. So let's see how that happens. So water molecules diffuse like any other molecule, but it has a special name. It's osmosis, but it is still diffusion. So the same principles apply. So when we get water moving into or out of a cell, we say it happens by osmosis. And we continue to say that the water is diffusing across a partially permeable membrane. And then we should always state the direction of the water, either into or out of a cell. And then we describe how it's managed to do that. And just like diffusion, it comes from an area of high water concentration or high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that low concentration could be because the water is actually containing a lot of salts or other dissolved substances. So for example, let's look at this diagram here. On the left hand side of this partially permeable membrane, we have water molecules. And on the right hand side, we have a very low concentration of water. There's none there, but we've also got other molecules that would dilute the water. So we've got a high concentration on the left. Those water molecules will move around or diffuse, and you'll get greater net movement across the membrane into the right hand side. So by osmosis, water diffused across this partially permeable membrane, entered into this cell from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Where can we see this in action? Well, if we take plants, this is another area of biology that you'll study one day. If you take a plant leaf and look underneath, well, you're going to need the microscope to see the next bit. But on the underside of most leaves, we will find very tiny holes called stomata. And you can see the stomata on these diagrams here. Now, when we get one stomata, it's called a stoma. And we can see that the stoma is made up of 2 cells and a little hole. So there's a little hole in the center here. And we've got a little video to the left where we can see the stomata opening and closing. Now this doesn't happen this fast, so this is sped up. But what's happening is that as the stoma opens, it's because these cells on the outside of them, which are called guard cells, are starting to either fill up with water or water's leaving. So at the moment, the water's now entering the cell and it's becoming turgid, filling up, and it made the stoma open. So it's open now because the cells are full of water. When the stoma is closed, it's because water leaves the cell and the cell becomes flaccid, thereby closing the stoma. You'll see this when you study the topic of transpiration. Transpiration is where water leaves the leaves through these stomata, and the plant needs to be able to control the water loss. But to summarise, we've looked at diffusion. This is where molecules diffuse from an area of high concentration to a low concentration. We've looked at active transport. Active implies energy use, and this is where molecules are taken against the concentration from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And we've looked at osmosis, which, just like diffusion, except we're talking only about water molecules, is where molecules diffuse from an area of high concentration to low concentration, but this is water only. And don't forget, it's passing through, or moving through, a partially permeable membrane. And osmosis is the way that we can explain how slugs will shrivel up if you put salt in them, something that many years ago I did as a little pastime, and I'm starting to feel a little bit guilty about.